Go. Hey guys, this is Saad for the Sad Truth. One of the beautiful things about my public engagement is that my world intersects once in a while with folks that otherwise I might not have met. Today I've got David Baddiel, who is a British comedian, presenter, screenwriter, and author. I first became aware of David when I read an article, I can't remember in which platform, where he was talking about how one can be an atheist and Jewish, which resonated with me. And that sent us off on several exchanges. And here you are. Welcome, David.
Hi, Gad. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Maybe you want to tell people
I'm
why
doing
you
well
might be.
too, but in a slightly weird way. So I had a medical procedure this morning, not a serious one. I basically had a stomach ache, and I needed someone to put a camera down my stomach to find out what's going on. Nothing bad is going on, but to do that, because I'm essentially not very male, like I got the option of like just having the tube down my stomach or with sedation. I said, give me the sedation. So I am chocker with fentanyl at the moment. And I don't want to promote fentanyl, especially not in North America. But it's the moment, at the moment, I'm quite enjoying it.
Okay, well, for the British, well, I'm glad that it's nothing serious. That's wonderful. We're by the way, we're roughly the same age. When I went and did a deep dive. It's not much of a deep dive, but I went onto your Wikipedia page. You're about 5 months older than me. You're born in May 1964, and I'm born in October 1964. And so in Arabic, you say "Aqbal al-miyya," meaning may we reach 100 together.
Right. Maybe we do that. That would be great.
That,
Yeah. When you look at me, do you think we're the same age? Do you think we look the same age? Because I have a notion, which is actually in my book, The God Desire, that at heart everyone feels about 12. That that adulthood, we're all winging adulthood. It's essentially a sham. And when we see ourselves looking old, we think, who's that? So you are younger than me, but I'm having to process that, even though I know I look old too. That's what I'm saying.
you are right that we always feel younger than we really are. I remember a very poignant story where my dad, this is probably 25 years ago, so he's now 93. So he would
He's
have
still
been,
with
well,
us. Your dad,
quite,
he's
sorry.
still alive. He's still alive. Your dad.
Thank God he's still alive, as is my mother. And so we were sitting watching TV, and a guy comes on television who looked, let's say, 25 years younger than he was at that point. And he looks at the guy on TV and he goes, "Do I look this old, Dad?" I said, "Dad, you look about 30 years older." And that shocked his world. He's like, "Really? I look older than that guy?" I said, "The guy is like, I mean, literally 3 decades younger than you." And so
Yeah.
I think you're right. We've got this false perception of how old we are.
Yeah, we do. I actually have, I don't know if it'll work on a Canadian, but because maybe this is just a British thing, but I know how you can tell what your soul, the age of your soul. By the way, obviously, I don't believe in a soul, but that's aside, what your soul is. And there used to be a show in Britain that every year it would change its name. It was a film review show. And when I was growing up, it was film, I'm going to say it like 82, right? So if you take when I was born, 1964, to then, that's clearly what I feel inside. Because if you say film to me and I choose a year for what that show should be, it's kind of 82, right? Uh, which makes me, I can't do the maths quickly, but actually that makes me about 16, right? In my soul. So if you had to choose a TV show called film, what would be the year?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably Cheers. Do you remember the comedy show Cheers?
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and
So that's
so,
that's how you feel that should be on TV when you turn on the TV.
well,
Cheers.
you know why? Because it really captured my formative years. I think it started in 82
Right.
when I was just finishing high school, and then it went off air by the time I was well into my PhD. And
Right.
so this is a show that took me from my high school days all through my education. And I
Yeah.
remember I had a really sad kind of nostalgic state that this was now over. You become attached to these characters. So that's probably the most iconic show that I can think of.
Okay. So that does put you in a coming of age time. If what you think of first off instinctively when you think of TV, that is what I'm saying is what the age you are really in your heart.
Got you. Speaking of television series and so on, my wife and I, this is our second crack at doing it, and boy, I'm glad that we went back to it. About a few years ago, we started watching Mad Men. Have you watched
Right.
that series?
I watched about half of the first series, and I didn't not like it. I actually really liked it, but something took me away from it. I think it was just before the idea of really long form TV was something I'd accepted. Because like I grew up, and in Britain particularly, a TV series is like 6 episodes, and then maybe there's another one a year later. That's 6 episodes. The idea of committing 3 months a year of your life to watching TV, that took me a while to get my head around. Now I'm really into it, and I watched Breaking Bad recently and thought it was like the greatest thing ever made.
Right.
So I need to go back to watch Mad Men, which is like
I
one of the
really highly recommend it. So Breaking Bad is also one of my favorite, and I came to it late, but a few years ago. So Mad Men appeals to me. I mean, sort of to our earlier discussion about how old you are. The cinema, well, first of all, I study psychology of decision making and evolutionary psychology and consumer psychology. So
right.
all the psychology of advertising that is the central running theme through the show. Mad Men, of course, is Madison Avenue, guys who work on Madison Avenue. But the cinematography, the icons, the set so appeals to me because it takes me back to when I was a kid growing up in Lebanon. So I was born in Lebanon, grew up there till the age of 11. We left in 1975, the first year of the Civil War. And I keep my fingers crossed that I will see a Pan Am logo because somehow those Pan Am logos are so attractive to me. Do you have such a brand that no longer exists that is very evocative of your childhood?
Yeah, I mean many. I mean loads of things. There was something in Britain. I think it still exists, but I don't think of it as it is now, which was R. White's lemonade. And it's partly because there was an advert that went with R. White's lemonade, which for no reason at all was a guy, because you don't have to hide drinking lemonade, but he used to tiptoe down the stairs like at night, and he used to sing a song about being a secret lemonade drinker. And there was an urban myth that that was Elvis Costello's dad. I remember that in Britain. And whenever I think of All White's Lemonade, I think of that guy and I think of me very young. Can I ask you a question about Mad
Please.
Men and consumer psychology? I mean, we have to get on to talking about Jewish atheism and stuff, but I got to ask you a question, which is there's one scene in the first episode, I think, of Mad Men that I've always thought is immensely evocative of something, which is a shift in understanding to do with how advertising work, but also how mass psychology works, which is that scene where is it Lucky Strike, where the cigarette company are going to Dan Draper and they're saying we can't basically say cigarettes are good. We can't do that anymore. We've been told legally. And he's just talking to them and asking about the cigarettes, and they say, how do you make them? And you make them like this, and you do that, and you toast them, and blah blah blah. And he says, what? And he says, well, you do this, and you toast them, and then he just writes down Lucky Strike, it's toasted.
That's
And
right.
that becomes the slogan. And I remember watching the thing, that is so clever because the idea of lateral thinking to advertise something feels to me like a very modern concept. And
Right.
sometimes you see that on a historical drama. You see modernity happening. And that's what I remember thinking about that.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I just so we restarted watching it again, and yesterday we watched exactly the episode that
Oh,
you just mentioned. And as I
right.
was watching it, I turned to my wife. I said, "You know what? I don't think I need to lecture anymore. I'm just going to play those episodes and
Yeah.
then just interject once in a while." I don't know if you remember the other scene where they talked about, this a doctor, I'm guessing a PhD, comes in and she shares a report with him about some of the positioning that they must do, and he takes the report and he throws it in the garbage. And I'm
No, I don't
thinking,
know that.
you don't remember that? And she talks
No.
about the death wish of Freud and so on. And so it's so up my alley. I mean, one of the things that I
Yeah.
love about advertising when I lecture to my students is that it really is part art, part science. There are
Yeah.
psychological principles that are predictable that we could apply. When is it appropriate to use fear-based advertising? When should you use humor? How many times can you show a humorous ad before people get tired of it? So there are absolutely clear scientific principles that we could use in designing optimal advertising copy. But there's
Mm.
also an art part. So that scene that you talked about, where it
Mm.
just came to him, he wasn't even prepared to do a pitch, and yet
Yeah.
and then suddenly everybody's happy.
Yeah.
That didn't come from, science 101. It just came organically from his brain. And that's what I love about advertising.
Yeah. No, that is really interesting. It's really interesting as well because, of course, all art at some level is also advertising because except in very very kind of like Puritan ideas of art, the artist does want their art to be seen. The art, to sell tickets. I went and saw a production of a Tom Stoppard play the other day, which had been redone, and it's a very difficult play, but they still want to sell tickets, and they still have things in the play that are designed to just like get people to come, get bums on seats, right?
Yeah.
And at no point really is there an artwork that isn't at some level advertising.
Well, I actually wrote an article. I can't remember exactly when, maybe 7, 8 years ago. I used to write often in a Psychology Today column, which I haven't been doing most recently. And I titled the article, Life is Marketing and Marketing is Life. So
Mm,
to your point, I was arguing that everything is marketing, right? When we go to the mating market, where in this case, I am the product and I'm advertising myself. In the labor market, I'm advertising myself. Within a group at a cocktail party, I'm advertising my belief system so that hopefully other people will like me. So everything beyond just selling Coca-Cola and Levi's jeans, everything is marketing. So when some people come at me and say, "Oh, but you're at a business school, you study consumer behavior. That's not serious." I say nothing could be more serious. I mean, short of
mm,
breathing,
mm.
we are a consumatory animal. So your
Yeah,
point is
no,
well taken.
that's correct. That's absolutely correct. Shall I, just because we started off talking about, but shall I talk a bit about the Jewish atheism thing?
Of course. So
'Cause-
let me just put up this. So this is the book where you develop that whole thesis, The God
yeah.
Desire. The other book that was sent to me, Jews Don't Count, and I also have access to your documentary based on that book. I haven't read yet. I can't put it up because you sent it as a PDF file. But so
Okay,
we've got,
I can, if it's
please
any
do.
good. This is Jews Don't Count.
Jews Don't Count and The God Desire. You take it wherever you want to go.
Well, Jews Don't Count. I can start with this actually because they relate to each other. Jews Don't Count is a bigger deal, certainly in terms of sales, and in terms of its impact on the conversation around anti-Semitism than the God Desire, which is a more kind of philosophical work really and doesn't have a sort of social purpose in quite the same way. But they relate to each other because one of the key ideas in Jews Don't Count, which is a book about how anti-Semitism has not received the same attention, the same concern, the same level of like protectiveness, if you like, that progressives would extend to other minorities, and why that is, and to do with the sort of deeply embedded notions of Jews and power, and how Jews don't really suffer from any kind of trauma or whatever. Is it all in Jews Don't Count? But part of that, a corner of it, which was actually very important, turned out to be more important than I realized, is my point is that anti-Semitism is racism. It's racism. It's not what people think it is. People tend to think it's religious intolerance, particularly in America, I've noticed, where racism is very ring-fenced for people of color, less so in Britain. And my point about the way I prove anti-Semitism is racism, which I can do very easily, is I am an atheist, but that would get me no passes at all out of Auschwitz. And indeed, my great uncle Arno, who was not a religious Jew, he was totally secular, died in the Warsaw Ghetto. Many other of my family, who were mainly non-observant Jews, died in the Holocaust. And in America now, white supremacists marching and chanting, "The Jews will not replace us." They won't. They wouldn't ask me if I keep kosher before they set light to my house. And so religion is kind of irrelevant to the racists, and that's quite an important corner of that book. Because I think people like to mark down anti-Semitism as basically it's just about religion, and religion is not as important as racism, right? So that led to me wanting to sort of explain a bit more in this book, in The God Desire, what a Jewish atheist means. And part of it was trying to express something quite complicated about how you can not believe in God as a supernatural being, but particularly if you're from a minority with a long history of persecution. I think that's sort of part of it, is you are moved in ways that are nothing to do with that belief by tradition and defiance and survival. I actually, in the book, talk about a friend of mine who tragically lost his son at a very young age, who is also an atheist and who sings Kaddish, Yit Gadal v'Yit Kadash Shemay Rabbah, at his funeral. I'm being intensely moved by that. And I'm not moved by the meaning of the words. I'm moved by the sonics of the word, because the sonics of the Hebrew plug into sort of centuries and centuries of what I think being a Jew means, which is actually very little, I think, to do with an actual imagination, which I think Christians do have, of a sort of person or version of a person or a godlike being that they are in a relationship with. I'm not sure, being Jewish is about that. And so the book is, that's partly the book, why the book happened. It's also an extension from that of my own feeling that atheism, as I understand it, as I've read many books about it, tends to be very, very dismissive of religion. And I'm not very dismissive of religion. I completely stone cold don't believe in God. I don't just don't believe in God. I sort of absolutely know there is no God. But I think that as a Jew, and as a Jew who understands the storytelling of what it means to be a Jew and how that culture has sort of, absolutely at the bedrock of my being, I think that a lot of the sort of what I would call white Christian men of the new atheists don't understand how religion teaches what it means to be human. And also in my particular case, my deep desire, which is where we get to the God desire, to believe in God, and this is a slightly depressive position, but I believe it to be the real one, informs me that there is no God. Because
Right.
I believe that that exists in the deep recesses of most humans, or in a mass cultural way as well. There's a mass psychological wish for there to be more meaning in life, for there to be life after death, for us to see our loved ones again, all sorts of things that we would like, and a hardwired need to worship. And all of that is serviced by a god. So we have created that thing in many different forms in order to surface that deep desire, sometimes mainly that we're not aware of. I mean, sometimes we're aware of it, but a lot of the time we're not aware of it. And my point is, I am an atheist who absolutely acknowledges that desire
Yeah.
within himself. And
Is
that's what doesn't happen in The God Delusion.
right
Or indeed
indeed.
in Bertrand Russell's books. That's just dismissed as obviously nonsense. And why would that comes back to the childish thing in a way? Is like you only a child, only a baby would be at all moved or interested in the idea of this fairy tale. And I think I say at one point that to dismiss religion as fairy tales is to not understand how you shouldn't dismiss fairy tales as fairy tales, because legends of how we live and how we create ourselves are key to understanding what it means to be human. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
Well, but your thesis resonates very much with me because you may or may not know. I mean, I'm very wedded to my Jewish identity. We're Lebanese Jews,
I do know
and
that, yeah.
but on the other hand, I too am not much of a believer in that. I don't worry that we need to set the candles because Chabad said it should be at 421, and if I do it at 422, I'm a bad Jew. And so, but yet, just like you, I understand that we have a shared history. We're part of a people. I understand that, and I mean, if you think that the way that you guys pray in Hebrew, might resonate with you, try to do it when you're Arabic speakers. I mean, it's taken me back to thousands of years ago. So the type of cadence of how we pray, no disrespect to my Ashkenazi brothers, but you really have to sit in a Syrian or a Lebanese or an Egyptian or an Iraqi or a Yemeni to maybe even get more of that sense of awe of shared history.
I'm really interested in that because I feel it. I feel, I think I say in the book when I'm listening to that, that I feel the echo of centuries of tradition and suffering and defiance. And I do. I think I quote also Simon Sharma, the historian, talks about when Jews were exiled from Spain, what would you hear as they were leaving the ports of Spain? The Shema.
Yeah,
And if you hear the Shema, you're going to be moved by the Shema or the idea of it, whether or not you believe that a God is listening. And I think as an Ashkenazi, I think you're right. I'm sure the music would be somehow more emotive if I was able to tune in to what it would be like for a Lebanese a Jew or a Syrian Jew or whatever. But I would like to think that there's a meeting place anyway.
sure, of
That
course.
we are all Jews and we have
Yes,
all heard that music at some point in our,
indeed.
in our inner souls. I'm using all these words that only religion can give you that I actually, don't believe in these things, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. But so I'm going to build on your argument that there is a functional value to being religious, and I'm going to come at it from the perspective of how an evolutionist would argue. So this may, I think, maybe interest you because you probably haven't attacked it from that angle. Evolutionists actually offer evolutionary based arguments for why religion exists. So there's what's called the adaptation argument. So this is where you have to argue that there is a unique, in this case, survival advantage to religiosity. And so, for example, David Sloan Wilson, who is a evolutionary biologist, I think he recently retired at State University of New York at Binghamton, we know each other well. He wrote a book now maybe 20 years ago called Darwin's Cathedral, where he uses a group selectionist argument to argue that if you take two groups, one of which scores high on religiosity, the other one which doesn't, well, the group that is religious is going to have a survival advantage because there are very earthly mechanisms that are conferred to the group that's religious: greater communality, greater cohesion, greater demarcation between in-group and out-group members, greater reciprocity relationships within in-group members. So there are real earthly benefits that are reaped by those who are religious. So that's the adaptation argument. Then there is an opposing argument that argues that religion, from an evolutionary perspective, is an exaptation. An exaptation is when you're piggybacking on an evolutionary mechanism. So, for example, our skeletal system is white, but that color is not itself adaptive. It is just a path-dependent thing that came up because other things have happened. And so, and from that perspective, religion is piggybacking on cognitive systems that evolved for other purposes. So, for example, our ability to see the world as blue team, red team, us versus them, coalitional thinking, while certainly the Abrahamic religions are very good at using that neuronal system, right? There are the Jews and the Goys. There are the believers and the kuffar in Islam.
Yeah.
There is those who are going to Jesus for eternity and the rest of us who are going to be damned in hell. And so there are very clear science-based, evolutionary-based arguments that support your claim that really the default value is to believe.
Yeah. So I don't, in the book, really go into those evolutionary arguments. I am aware of them, although not in the way that you are. The way I tend to write these books, because I come from stand-up, is just essentially out of my head, with not a lot of sort of data and proper academic research, and thus they are short and anecdotal, and that seems to be one of the reasons that they do okay. But I talk about identity. It's not a word you use, but I think it's important in what you're talking about. In that religion confers a whole host of advantages. Some of them are obvious social advantages, which would have a Darwinian, if you want to look at it in those terms, advantage, obviously, because it will create a tribal cohesion to share the same identity. And religion gives you a host of things of which you could basket them as identity. So I would say sort of meaning is one of those. And another one, which is very, very live now because of social media, is a way in which you can project your identity to those around you. Religion is able to do that because religion has meetings in it. It has colors. It has things you can wear. It has prayers you can say that only your people say. But what that allows you to do is say, I am a important and supportive member of the tribe. Now, what is very interesting, and you touched on it just then, is that humans seem to be unable to project an identity without it being in opposition. It seems that the strengthening of identity, which is very important to human beings, they should feel, I am this, I am a Catholic, or whether it be, I am an anti-vaxxer now, or whether it be whatever it is, I am woke, whatever it is. Now, it seems impossible to do that in and of itself. The way you have to build it, and social media has created an incredibly dysfunctional ability to do that, is by hating on the ones who are not you, by creating an idea of the ones who are not you and being angry with them, and then hopefully, again, social media allows for this, but it's a very religious idea, bringing the people with you who are part of the tribe in order to, mob hate on them and then get mob hate back. And this just reinforces your identity. And it feels to me that the performative nature of all that is all there in religion, because religion has always had Catholics hating Protestants, or Jews and Philistines, or whatever it might be. It seems that the binary nature of identity always involves who is my opposite, how can I build, or how can the tribe, if you want to be more Darwinian about it, how can the tribe reinforce its identity by having this negative version of itself?
Right. Well,
Yeah,
and religion does another incredible thing. I mean, to your point. So take, for example, Islam. In Islam, the Islamic nation is called the Ummah, right? Well, what that does is it now removes otherwise immutable characteristics that would otherwise put us in different tribes. It no longer matters whether I'm black or white, or whether I am from Morocco or Malaysia. What matters now is we are united in the fact that we are part of the Ummah. So it becomes a supra mechanism by which we can erase all those other characteristics, and therefore we belong to the same group. It's a brilliant memeplex, to use Daniel Dennett's term.
memeplex is not a word I know. Well, what?
So memeplex is basically a collection of memes. So memes is a term, of course, that you probably know from Richard Dawkins in
Yeah,
his book The Selfish Gene. So
I do.
Daniel Dennett, I think he's the originator of the term, argued that something like religion is a memeplex. I think the term comes. So, for example, when you talk about a cineplex, it's a
I see.
multiplicity of movie theaters in one place. So a memeplex is a coherent narrative made up of distinct memes, making up a memeplex.
Okay, because I think as far as I remember in The God Delusion, what Dawkins actually does is use the word meme to draw a parallel, which I don't completely agree with genes. So because he's such a Darwinist, he can't understand the spread of religion because it doesn't have a biological basis and it seems to have no obvious evolutionary basis. And so he talks about the spreading of memes exactly as if they were genes. And I don't think it works entirely like that. And actually, one thing that I think speaks to that is what you've just said about the Ummah. Is also true of the way that Christianity spreads, because Christianity is an evangelical religion. And as an evangelical religion, obviously, it was able to colonize a lot of the world. Judaism is odd because Judaism is not a proselytizing religion.
Yeah.
It's really fucking hard to become a Jew.
From
And
a
also,
from a marketing perspective,
yeah,
Judaism sucks.
it completely sucks. And actually, I talk about this in the book. I got quite a bad review from the Jewish Chronicle, a newspaper that I sometimes write for. But hey, one is, prophet is not without honor, saving his own country, because the reviewer felt that I was someone who liked Christianity more. And that was a misunderstanding of the book. Because I don't like or dislike any religion particularly, but I was saying Christianity is much more successful, which it obviously is in terms of size. And that's not just to do with the fact that it's an evangelical religion. That's to do with the fact that I think that I actually use the example of Hollywood screenwriting. That if you read a book called Save the Cat, which is a book on how if you wanted to do a formulaic Hollywood story, you might notice that your hero should be empathetic. So that's number one, where Christianity has done better than Jews because they've created a God who is a man, right, rather than a formless being. So empathy's there straight away. Then it might tell you, have that character, your hero, be of lowly stock, because you want to feel that he is an underdog and he's got a lot of obstacles to overcome. Then you might say, make him do good things early on in the film. Make him do various good things, small good things that slowly building to more and more good things. And then at the end of the movie, what you really want is a big sacrifice. This is all in Save the Cat. In Act 3, you want a huge sacrifice that this person does so that you really feel that this person has, gone on the journey towards your love, right? Your love as a character and engagement. And it turns out the New Testament had all those beats down, 2,000 years early. And that, I think, is why you see the spread of that religion. But it's interesting that Jews who somehow or other have survived, I do think I actually wrote a piece very recently about this, about Jews' incredible ability to survive, because it makes no sense, right? Jews are a very small religion. They've been mainly genocided over many, many centuries, or ghettoized or exiled or whatever. They don't encourage people who are not born Jewish to join them. And yet, some or other, a small amount, 15 million of us, still exist. And so, given that I'm an atheist and don't think this is because we are Hashem's chosen people, I'm somewhat mystified as to why we've managed to do that. But yeah, but some religions are memeplex, did you call it? Are,
Memeplex, yes.
are very memeplex. Judaism is not, I
Right.
think.
No, that's a
It
good point.
doesn't spread itself in that way.
Well, you were just, talking about the structure, the narrative of Christianity, which kind of leads me to another point that's not necessarily religious, but that I think will resonate with you. So you're obviously a writer. You also write fiction. You're a screenwriter.
Mm.
So there's and I know that you pursued a PhD but never finished it. Maybe we want to
That's
talk
correct.
about what that you should go back and finish that PhD. You
My
really need.
grandmother, who is long dead, that was all she wanted. My grandmother, Otti Fabian, who was a refugee from Nazism, on my mother's side, they were refugees. My mum was actually born in Nazi Germany. Uh, when I was 21, I didn't have enough money to be a comedian. And at that time, which is now an amazing idea, the government in Britain would give you money to be a student and even to be a PhD student. You could get a grant really easily. And so I got a grant and I was at London University doing a PhD in Victorian sexuality and literature, was what it was. And she, although I don't think she particularly knew what I was doing, but she just loved the idea of me being Dr. Baddiel at the end of it. And then she was just pissed off. It didn't really matter that I was on
Well,
TV.
I'm going to speak on behalf of your grandmother. You ready?
Please do. Yeah.
Okay, so two stories that I mentioned, forgive plugging my own book. In this book
No,
right
no,
here,
fine. Yeah,
The
do
Sad
that.
Truth About Happiness, I talk about towards the end of the book about the psychology of regret and how oftentimes the things that we regret, we could actually still affect change. And it's too late for me to be a basketball player. I'm too old, too short, and not good enough to be a basketball player. But
Yeah.
so here are two stories that are going to resonate with you regarding your incompleted PhD. Story one, I think his name is Dagobert Bro. He was a guy who left just as the Nazis were coming into power, Jewish guy, moved to Montreal, became a businessman, never pursued his lifelong dream of, going to university. Then when he finished his career, he retired. He was in his 60s. He said, well, you know what? Now I've got some time. Why don't I go back and do my undergraduate in his 60s? He completes his undergrad. He says, "Well, I'm young. I'm still healthy." In his 70s, he begins his master's. Fast forward at the age of 92, this is at my university where I'm a professor, and it used to be called the Thursday Report, which was the weekly newspaper of the university. I think the title on the front page was "Finally a Doctor at 92." And so
Right.
he obtained his PhD at 92. Story two, Memfred Steiner, who is a gentleman who came on my show about a year and a half ago, got his MD degree in 1955, David, and
Mm.
then picked up a PhD in biochemistry in 1967 as part of his training in hematology. But his main love had always been physics. But his
Right.
parents had said, "What is this physics stuff? This is not serious stuff. Have a serious profession, do something practical, become a physician." So after he retired from medicine, after a long, illustrious career as a hematologist, he went back, pursued physics, and at the age of 89, a year and a half ago, I think, got his PhD and came on my show. So based on those two stories, you're still a spring chicken, so there's no
I
reason
am.
for you not to go back and do your PhD.
Okay, so you're right. I actually wrote like 90% of it, which is kind of weird, considering that you would think just finish it, David. Because I could just finish it and just submit it. And I might, and I'll take your advice. But there is a couple of reasons why not. Number one, when I've read it now, and I wrote a lot of it in the 80s, it's academically massively out of date in terms of the way that literary theory and stuff. It's very, infected by sort of Foucault and ideas about literary theory that were very prominent in the 80s. It's kind of post-structuralist, and I'm not bothered about all that stuff anymore. Although it's mainly historicist. It's mainly looks at the Victorian in terms of like how the history of Victorian thought is there in all the literature. But the other thing is physics, which is so my dad was a working class guy and not a refugee, although a few generations back they were fleeing from Russian pogroms, and obviously, in fact, there's a story which I don't know if it's true or not, but that my great grandfather smuggled himself on a timber ship from Latvia, from running away from Russians. He was on his way to New York, and because he didn't speak any English, he just got off at the first stop, which was Swansea in Wales, which is where my dad's
I
from. And
actually wondered why your dad was from Swansea. I couldn't, so now I got
yeah,
the story.
Yeah, so, but presumably my great-great-grandfather, 10 years down the line, spoke enough English or Welsh to say, where is the Statue of Liberty? And they said, no, it's a long way over there. You got off the boat too early. But my dad got out of poverty by studying chemistry and became he ended up actually he taught in New York for a bit in upstate New York in Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which is in Troy, upstate New York. That's where I was born. But then he came back to Britain and he had a job in science for quite a long time before he was made redundant. And when I was a kid, I realized that was not in my gift to do those subjects. I was good at words and English, but my dad, in a way that is not good parenting, like now, this is like definitely not good parenting. When I eventually told him I don't want to do science subjects, he said, "Well, that's a waste of a brain." Right. As I say, not what you would tell kids now. But the interesting thing about it is he's dead now, and I spend all my time reading popular. I can't do the maths to do it properly, but I read popular physics books all the time. And I wrote a play called God's Dice, which is a play trying to match up religion and physics. It's actually a play about a woman who appears in a lecturer's room one day, a young woman, and she's a Christian, and she uses probability to suggest I can provide you equations to show you the probability of water turning into wine, or the Red Sea parting, or all the miracles. She's a kind of genius, and she's able to come up with physics equations to show you, because in an infinite universe, right? In an infinite universe, if anything that can happen will happen, it is sort of possible for water to turn into wine in an infinite universe. A tiny, tiny, tiny possibility, but it's possible. And therefore you can work out the possibility, right? So that I wrote that play, and if it's a good play, but it's also an example of the return of the repressed, because I think my dad, wanted me to be a scientist and I couldn't do that, but I sort of repressed it in me. And then it's coming out now in my fascination with science. And also, can I ask you a question, actually?
Please.
Another thing, which is, I think it's a bit different for you because you're in, what is your area of study? What would you call it?
So evolutionary consumer psychology.
Okay, so that seems to be like a proper subject, right? I studied English and I'm a writer and I love my subject, but a tiny part of me, and I think all people who work in the arts think this, thinks proper cerebral work is being done elsewhere. Proper cerebral work is being done essentially in the sciences, right? And so I think that uh, my dad saying it's a waste of a brain is a bad thing to say. A part of me believes it. A part of me believes
No, I'm gonna.
I should be doing physics.
So I just spoke first on behalf of your late grandmother. Now I'm
Yeah,
going to address your late father. You ready? And I'm
yeah.
going to cater to his point about it. Only science could be proper, which I
He was a
disagree.
if you're going to address him, he was a doctor because he's got
So,
a
okay, well, there you go, Dr. Baddiel.
PhD in biochemistry, Dr. Colin Brian Baddiel.
So get ready. So
Yeah,
earlier you were mentioning that in your outdated manuscript for your dissertation, you were using a post-structuralist and Michel
yeah,
Foucault, and I go on and on. So in the parasitic mind, in my 2020 book,
yeah,
I talk
yeah,
about parasitic ideas and idea pathogens, of which the biggest one is postmodernism. That's the
yeah.
granddaddy of all parasitic
I
ideas.
agree. I agree
Okay,
with that.
okay. But here's a way where we can still have you do finish your dissertation and it being properly scientific. You ready? And by the
Yeah,
way, you owe me a major
yeah,
game at either Arsenal or Chelsea or Manchester City when I
yeah.
come next to
And
England.
also a massive credit in the book that gets published as a result of this.
There you go. So
Yeah,
so I think if you've never heard of this, I hope that this serves as an epiphany, because I think it truly is an exciting field. So there's a field, David, called Darwinian literary criticism. Have you heard
all
of
right.
that?
No.
So basically, what you're doing there is you're arguing. So rather than doing a literary critical, endeavor using a Marxist lens or a postmodernist lens or a
Yeah,
feminist lens, you
yeah,
use actually the proper scientific lens, which is that literature moves us. And the fact that we're able to, link and understand some ancient Greek poem in exactly the way if it were being said today is
yeah,
because there are a few underlying universal themes in literature that are exactly catering to our shared biological heritage. So I can
yeah,
study Victorian sexuality. As a matter of fact, there's a book called Madame Bovary's Ovaries,
Right.
where they literally look at all of these classic literary themes using a Darwinian lens. So here comes soon to be Dr. Baddiel, the young one, the David one,
Yeah.
where he applies a very formal evolutionary biological and evolutionary psychological approach to studying whichever literary genre he wants. Now your dad is happy because you are, quote, applying science. What do you think of
I'm a
that?
science. That's brilliant. Well, thank you, Gad. That's like sorted out an enormous amount of psychological issues for me in one go. I tell you one, what's very interesting about it, really interesting about it, is I mentioned in passing that the way that I looked at literature was historicist primarily. And to get over the fact that you're right, it's got far too much postmodernism in it because it was written in the 80s and I was young. But there's something I still believe in, but with a twist now, depending on what you've said, which is that history does contextualize art. And I remember when I first came upon this idea, I was very excited by it, partly because I think because of my dad, again, a part of me doesn't want to be totally free floating intellectually about art. I want to feel that there's something concrete. And I remember I had a teacher, a really brilliant teacher, who was basically a historian called Lisa Jardine. And I went to see Lisa lecture, and she was lecturing about the Fairy Queen, which is by Spenser. And it was a massive poem written at the start of Elizabeth's first reign. And she said, why is virginity so important in this poem? And her point was, up to that point, people writing courtly poetry would have premised valor and heroism as their main objective for their heroes, because that's what their monarchs were doing. They were going off to fight wars and crusades. And then suddenly they had a female monarch. What's her version of heroism at that point in time in 1550?
Interesting.
It's chastity. That's a heroic thing for a female monarch to do. And I remember sitting there thinking, suddenly literature has a reality. It's not just people saying, "Oh, I like this poem," or "I don't like this poem." It's that felt to me like intellectually concrete. So I became very historicist in the way that I looked at literature, and I think I wrote some quite interesting things actually from that point of view. But I would have changed now a bit to almost entirely what you have just said, except I don't know that I would put a Darwinian lens on it, which is I do believe now more in the eternality of human experience.
Right.
So as I've moved away politically to some extent, I used to be very left wing. I now think of myself as purely free floating politically. Like I don't have a political home at all. I think, in fact, having a political home in your head as a brand, it just squashes original independent thought. And as part of that, I think that assuming that everything is entirely dependent on your immediate historical context has that slightly Marxist element to it, which I no longer completely. I think history is incredibly important, but not in that way that there is nothing that can exist without the confines of your immediate historical circumstance. That's a very kind of Marxist idea. Now I think, no, you're right. There's something that in eternal humanity that means that when you read Shakespeare or when you read Sophocles, there is history and there is also something that binds us to that
Indeed.
art.
And so in several of my early books in evolutionary psychology, I have chapters which I title cultural products as fossils of the human mind. And so
Right.
my argument there is that if you're a paleontologist and you want to study the phylogenetic history of a species, then your currency are the fossil remains and the skeletal remains. And I can say very precise things about the mating behavior of a animal that has now been extinct for 65 plus million years based on those fossil remains. On the other hand, when it comes to the human mind, it doesn't fossilize, it's organic. But what I argue is the cultural products that human minds leave behind are fossils. And so I could study the ancient Greek poem, I could study the song lyric, or I could study the troubadour, I could study movie themes, screenplays, or plays in general, and I can study all of those things informed by the evolutionary lens because it will say some profound things about our shared biological heritage. So I think, I mean, there are now a growing number of literary critics that are using Darwinian theory, but it is still a very small field. So again, not to again channel your grandmother, there are ways by which you can so easily write something innovative about a particular set of, literary period, be it Victorian or other, where you incorporate the Darwinian lens. And boy, would you take off the originality element, because so few literary critics do use that lens.
Right. I mean, this is to move it slightly away from like helping me rewrite my PhD. But what occurred to me when you were speaking is music. Is
Yes.
like, because of course, people say all art aspires to the condition of music, but one reason for that is that music is timeless. Shakespeare, I think, is also timeless, but he's also not timeless. Like a lot of what Shakespeare's writing is to do with what's going on in Tudor time, in Renaissance times, right? Whereas the abstract way in which we can be moved by music from almost any period. I mean, as it happens, I like music from the 1970s, which is probably why, because I was growing up then.
Give
But
me, give me some groups quickly.
well, I've come back round to really liking prog rock. So I having thought, well, that's not cool for ages. I now thought, what am I talking about? Who cares what's cool? So I like Genesis and
Okay.
Jethro Tull and Pink Floyd, but I also like singer-songwriters, including Canadian singer-songwriters, particularly Joni Mitchell and Neil Young.
Okay.
Uh, so I'm very big fans of them. But sometimes I sit down and listen to, Tchaikovsky or Bach particularly, and find myself incredibly moved by it in a way that clearly you cannot historicize, because it doesn't have an obvious meaning that you can do that to. That thing I said about the Fairy Queen, which I like intellectually, but you can't do that with Bach. You can't say exactly why the history has created this particular sound and why it moves you now, 400 years later.
Yeah, beautiful. By the way, there is a field called evolutionary
Of
musicology.
course there is.
Of course, there is. By the way, one of the ideas that I'm thinking for my next book, I'm not sure if I've sold myself on the idea, is to write a book demonstrating that the amount of new insights that could be gleaned from applying the evolutionary lens in fields that you wouldn't typically expect it to be present in. So, what does evolutionary architecture look like, or
Mm.
evolutionary musicology, or evolutionary literary criticism? I mean, I touch on this in some of my previous books, but I thought I would do an entire book where every chapter would be evolution and fill in the blank of a different discipline. I think that might work well. What are your first thoughts about such a project?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't realize you were quite so evolutionary. And I think it is the case, as far as I can make out, that almost any field of study or endeavor can be examined in a Darwinian way. That
Right.
seems to be the case because, as we said earlier on, everything is marketing, and everything is marketing can obviously have a reproductive basis,
Yes.
or a social status increasing basis, which is, in terms of what you said earlier, a species drift or whatever the word is. I don't know if that's the right expression, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Of
Yeah.
what word you use for something that was at an original basis and then becomes something else?
Exaptation.
Exaptation.
Exaptation
Yes,
instead
I've
of
heard of that.
adaptation.
Yes. Yes, I've heard of that because this is going to seem a strange thing to mention, but the book I'm writing at the moment is based on a show I did about my parents, and my mum. It's very much about my mother, who one of the things in her life that was the defining thing in her life was that she had an affair with a golfing memorabilia salesman, and then turned our lives over to golf. She became totally obsessed with golf, and everything in our house was golf and golfing based. And the comedy of it was that somehow my dad didn't notice that this meant she was having an affair with the golfing memorabilia salesman. But and it's good that you've told me, because I think I use species drift and I should use acceptation. I use the example of that in the middle of this book to say, I don't believe that my mother was really that interested in golf. But what happened was her desire, which is the kind of evolutionary desire, I guess, to be with this guy was so strong that it moved her to a position whereby she was obsessed with golf, which doesn't really make sense because, from his point of view, she just became a rival in the market of golfing memorabilia stuff, right? And as far as I know, he was always a bit annoyed about it, but she couldn't stop herself because something in her was being pushed to
But
proving that she
did
was
your
more.
parents separate,
She did
or
for a bit, and then they got back together again.
okay,
Yeah.
so she left the golf guy and went back
No,
to your
she was just having an affair with the golf guy. They were never actually together. But she was a part of, because my mother was the key thing, and this is more how I think and not so Darwinian, maybe, in terms of I'm fascinated by human psychology and I don't always apply. I mean, you might have a Darwinian version of this, but I think the reason my mum was like that is she was a refugee. Her life in Germany, had Hitler never existed, would have been very glamorous. She was from a very wealthy background. They owned a brick factory in a place called Königsberg. I've actually been there. It's called Kaliningrad now. And they had servants, and she would have had probably quite a glittering marriage. All that went, and she ended up with my working class Welsh dad, who was quite angry. But I think at some level, she always imagined this glamorous life that she would have had. And the nearest thing she could find in suburban London in 1973 was this kind of golf guy, right?
So your dad forgave her and then they lived out their life together.
No, my dad just never talked about it.
Okay, well, but that itself is incredibly shocking. So let me give you some stats that might either surprise you or not. Let's see. When a man cheats on a woman,
Yeah.
it doesn't at all mean that the relationship will end. I think if I'm getting the number, I might get the numbers slightly off. It's about a 30% chance that the marriage will dissolve when a man cheats on a woman. When a woman cheats on a man, it almost, and this is cross-cultural, it almost guarantees it. It's roughly in the 90% range, right? So your dad and your mom fell in the 10% anomaly. Now, the reason from an evolutionary perspective,
They were quite anomalous in lots of ways.
there you go. So,
Yeah.
but the reason why it is an unforgivable act is because of a basic Darwinian mechanism of paternity uncertainty. So
Okay.
men have evolved the emotional, cognitive, and behavioral systems to be very unforgiving of these kinds of dalliances because we're a biparental species, and I don't want to go around raising the sexy gardener's son. And
Yeah.
therefore, you cheat on me, we're done. And so it's quite incredible that your dad put
That's
up with that.
interesting. Well, as I say, he never really admitted it to himself. Everyone else knew, including the children. My dad, who was not an open man emotionally, never really admitted, I think, that my mum was doing that. And the key element in my dad's life, to be honest, was that he was a very lazy man. Like he hated any form of aggravation, any form of sort of emotional journeying. And for him, it was just easier to stay with my mum. I should say he was in no way a sort of beta male, however. He was by far the largest figure in our house. He was kind of a big, strong, quite angry man, but he just couldn't be fucked, I think. He did briefly, when they were separated, I was a bit older, have a relationship with a woman. He by that time he'd been made redundant. He worked in an antiques market. And I said, "Who is it?" And he went, "Oh, she's a Macedonian. It's aggravation." And that's all I knew about her. So, and then he got back with my mum because he couldn't be bothered, really. So it was more that. But that is very interesting. How much more time have we got? Because there's something I wanted to ask you.
Oh, as long as you want. Do you want to go for another 15 minutes?
Yeah, sort of 15 minutes. Yeah, that
Let's
would be
do it.
cool.
Okay.
I mean, I just in terms of the Jews don't count thing. So
Sure.
one of the key elements of Jews don't count, which you haven't read, but I'd be really interested to see what you think when you do read it, is that I talk about the ways in which the reasons why Jews are not in this kind of what I call a sacred circle
Right.
of minorities that are considered oppressed enough for progressives to ally with them. The Jewish allyship is not really a thing. And this is to do with the fact that, you know, Jews are the only minority that have got this weird dual status in the imagination, in the racist imagination, which is that, like all minorities, they're seen as kind of low status, as thieving or lying or whatever. But they also, Jews have this one other thing, which is we are high status. We are powerful and rich and in control of the world. And that excludes us from that. The other thing that excludes us, and this is the question I want to ask you, is that Jews are generally seen as white. But this is a particularly big thing, I would say, in the modern binary where white is the apogee of everything bad. Now, my position is that Jews are not straightforward. Well, obviously, there are Jews of color, which I want to come to you about anyway, but also no Jew is exactly white because Jews have constantly been classed as non-white
Right.
by the Nazis or whoever it might be. But then, of course, there's someone like you who is a Lebanese Jew, right? And I don't know whether what you consider yourself to be, but I would say that the failure of progressives to think of you as, you know, not just any other white bloke, right, is part of the problem. I don't know how you feel
Oh,
about
no. Listen, David, I have used that exact argument against all the wokesters because so I always tell them that I outrank all of you in victimology poker,
yeah,
right? So for example, recently, I don't know if you heard the problems that are happening with the president of Harvard, Claudine
of
Gay.
course I do. Yes.
Right. And so the president of the NAACP had come out saying, oh, these accusations against her are a form of white supremacy. She's a brilliant academic and so on. So I, offered a rebuttal on Twitter, which went completely viral, where I offered, rebuttals to each of his points. And at the end, to your point, I said, I would be very careful about accusing me of white supremacy because I am a childhood war refugee of color, an Arabic speaking Jew. So I outrank you in victimology poker. So be careful. Well, guess what? I do it in a kind of diabolical
Of
way,
course.
right? Right. But guess what? It works, David, because in their completely warped, parasitized minds, you know, if I'm a greater victim, therefore my arguments are correct. It's not the veracity of the argument that matters, but if you say something against Islam, that's bad because you're an Ashkenazi. But if I say something against Islam, my words are words of color, therefore
Mm.
they simply carry more weight. It's
Yeah.
insane, but that's the world we live in.
But it's very interesting that. So one of the things I try and explain to people, I actually did a big interview with Haaretz just now, which went very viral. And they slightly misquoted me because the headline says Jews are a glitch in the matrix. And I think this was a translation thing because what I actually said was Jews are a glitch in the binary. I might
Right.
have said in the matrix of the binary, but what I mean is that power relationship, which is often about whiteness or non-whiteness, is one of the many ways in which Jews fuck up the victimizer victimized binary that rules thinking in general. And one of the ways in which we fuck it up is that it's impossible a lot of the time to say exactly what the whiteness or otherwise of Jews is. You're a brilliant example of that.
Yeah, exactly.
You're very, very difficult to classify, right? In terms of
Exactly
your
right.
what, but you know what that does a lot of the time. I mean, it may work for you, and you that devilishness, I absolutely understand it. But also, I think it frustrates and annoys those who just want the binary to be straightforward, and it's another reason why anti-Semitism happens. I mean, I'm not blaming you. I think it's a good thing. It's a very good thing to subvert those people, but I think you'll find in my heart of hearts, if you ask me, what's happening now and what this book is about, that it's a cry for complexity. That
Right.
Jews essentially represent complexity in understanding the world. And the fact that you've just listed about 5 categories that are all dancing with each other, like some kind of subatomic particle that you can't locate, that frustrates people who want the world to be simple.
Indeed. And by the way, your book, when did it come out? Jews Don't Count.
It came out in 2021, start of
Oh,
2020.
so I mean, boy, is it even more relevant after
Yeah.
the reaction of post October 7th, right?
Yeah, no, obviously it is. I mean, actually, in the book, when you read it, you'll see I have my position on Israel is fairly narrow. So I have a very short chapter about Israel. And the reason I have a short chapter about Israel, which again will be interesting for you as a Lebanese Jew, is that I'm saying, right, what I tend to get up to the point that I wrote the book and still afterwards, when I talk about anti-Semitism, is what about Israel? What about Palestine? And my answer to that is, I'm talking about a centuries old racism here, like something that's really complex and really old. Do not reduce it to stuff that's happening in the Middle East and has only been going on for a few years, really,
Oh,
because
I completely agree with that.
that's what progressives would do. Like they think you can upend or subvert any conversation about anti-Semitism just by saying, "What about Palestine?" And my position is that's actually not what I'm talking about, and it's reductive for you to do that. And also, no progressive person would go up to a British Chinese person talking about how they might be experiencing some racism in Britain and say, well, firstly, I want you to talk about the Chinese state and what they're doing to the Uyghurs before I allow you into the
Right.
conversation. That just
Right.
doesn't happen, right?
But one of the things that frustrates me to no ends about the creation of modern day Israel in 1948 is that it has allowed a whole panoply of Jew haters to change the justification of their, just visceral, diabolical Jew hatred and say, oh no, all of my hatred is related to Zionism. I love the damn Jews. It's just the Zionists that I hate. And I
No,
mean, again, demonstrably, that is such a god. I mean, just look at what Hamas says. I mean, and of course, as an Arabic speaker, I can show you an endless litany of speeches that they give to their people at the mosque. where they never utter a single time anything about land. As a matter of fact, they often say it doesn't matter if we got back everything from the river to the sea, Jews must be eradicated. And so it really frustrates me when Westerners say, oh no, everything that you're saying in terms of global Jew hatred today stems from Israel. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Well, not it's yeah. So before all this happened, this copy of my book is actually the American copy, and I'd already added a bit more.
Put it up so people can see the
Okay,
whole thing.
sorry.
Thank you.
Then I wanted to about Israel because I wanted to take in that point specifically, and I used an example, which is in 2019 where there was an Israel-Gaza conflict, now forgotten about, but there were quite a lot of marches in London, and there was a march in Hyde Park, and there were two things about it that were notable. Uh, Number one, there was a placard that had a picture of Jesus on it. And it had a picture of Jesus on it on the cross, and it said, "Don't let them do it again." So if you want to separate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, there it is. Because Israel, the state of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu was not around in AD 33, cheering for Team Barabbas. That was not happening. And as a result, it's clear that them means the eternal Jew. And that's how you can actually people say, oh, can't tell the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Yes, you can, because the eternal trope will only be applied to Jews. And there's something else, which is that an activist, a guy called Tariq Ali, at that thing, he said something which is very common and relates to what you just said, and I get it all the time, which is he just said if the occupation ends, and the brutality ends, anti-Semitism will fade away. So I don't know if Tariq had forgotten, but in 1948, when the State of Israel was set up, there had been a fairly big global anti-Semitic event like a few years before that, which was not related to conflict in the Middle East. So it really offends me, the notion that anti-Semitism, this unbelievably persistent form of persecution and racism, is just about what's happened obviously it is driven now in the way you're talking about, but it is also very, very reductive to imagine that that's all there is.
By the way, speaking of the event that happened in the 30s and 40s, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was going on little love getaways with Adolf Hitler, where the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was saying, once we're done with the Jewish problem in Europe, don't worry, I'll take care of the Jews in the Middle East. And they were super simpatico with this grand sort of final solution, bringing the final solution to the Middle East. This is well before the creation of modern day Israel. So even historically, it just doesn't add up. But yet, it's almost impenetrable to reason. I mean, I've tried to engage some of these folks. One quick point, and then I'll cede the floor to you, and then we'll wrap it up soon. Maybe talk about some of your future projects coming up. We escaped the Lebanese civil war. I mean, under imminent threat of execution. I could tell you stories.
That to do with being Jewish, by the way? Was your imminent threat of execution to do with your Jewishness, or was it just political?
No, to be being Jewish, there was a family a couple of streets down. A couple of houses down from us that was rounded and killed. Right, because what happens in Lebanon, at least at the start of the civil war, is there would be these random roadblock checks manned by militia. And then you would be asked to show your card. In Arabic, you say hawiyya, which is like an internal ID card, which is the most prominent thing on that card is your religion. The Jews were referred to as Israeli, which means Israelite. It wasn't even Yehudi, which is Jew. So you lost your Lebanese identity. You were just an Israelite. Now, there weren't going to be many roadblocks if you were stopped that you were going to get out of without having a bullet in your head. So there was an endless number of ways that you were going to die in the Lebanese civil war, some of which had nothing to do with being Jewish, but a lot of it with it being
Right.
Jewish. By the way, my parents were subsequently kidnapped by Fatah, a Palestinian militia group, and some really bad things happened there. So no, it was absolute. I mean, there are no Jews left in Lebanon. It's not because of magic, right? And so it was completely related to being Jewish. The anti-Semitism, even in progressive Lebanon, was incredible. But my point is that for all of the Jew hatred that I experienced as a kid growing up in Lebanon, it still left me shocked to see the level of Jew hatred I have seen since October 7, and coming from completely different sides. So I have the progressive academic types, right, who went to the Near East studies programs. You know, Jews are the occupiers. They're sending me hate mail. I'm getting the from the right side, the Jews won't replace us guys sending me the hate mail. And of course, I'm getting the usual Islamic guys. So the
Right.
Jew hatred now is coming from every direction. Whereas at least when I was in Lebanon, it was just good old fashioned Islamic, Middle East based Jew hatred. But now I'm getting it from everywhere. So it's
Well, so do
unbelievable.
I. So do I get it's so do I. I mean, all the time. I mean, you know, I can turn off social media, so which is where it resides in a big way. But also, you know, it's there also in IRL. It's there on the streets at the moment, and it's there, you know, in all sorts of ways. And it's really extreme at the moment. And you're right, there is that sort of weird 360-degree nature of it. There's no but if when you read Jews Don't Count, so people like partly what I talk about in that is what I don't talk about it, but this is what I'm sort of talking about, which is a sort of dynamic. Because people say, "Oh, is it? You know, you're trying to say it's worse from progressives than from the far right." No, I'm saying the whole thing is in a dance, a very dysfunctional dance,
Right.
right? Because you know you're there, you progressive, supposedly operating this kind of protective sanctuary space for minorities against the far right. If you choose to neglect Jews within that and aggressively neglect Jews within that, what does that do in terms of opening up the possibility of violence against them, which, as you say, can also come from other directions as well? And then the violence somehow is overlooked or considered understandable at this time. And then you're in a very, very dysfunctional space, I think.
Let's end it on hopefully a slightly more
Yeah.
positive, less dire note. Are
Yeah.
there any projects that you're currently working on that you'd like to use this opportunity to plug?
Yeah, I mean, I've got this memoir I'm writing, which is going to come out next year. I'm still doing stand-up comedy, so I shall be recording. I've done 3 shows in the last 10 years. I'm recording them all for TV for Sky Arts. And if any British people are listening to this, I will be recording them at the Royal Court, which is a really great theatre in March, and you can come and watch them being recorded. But I think the thing that you will be most interested in as a Darwinian, I didn't really understand how Darwinian you are, is so these small books that I write, they're kind of polemical books. People want me to write another one about Jews, but I don't think I'm going to do that just because I want to write about something different. So the one I'm going to write, I think, is about maleness. Because I've noticed through reading quite a lot of feminist books that there is no man really writing about male desire. No sort of interesting man. I don't mean kind of Andrew Tate or whatever. I mean no sort of interesting, like a friend of mine called Caitlin Moran, who's a really great writer and she's a feminist in this country, wrote a book called What About Men, which I'm actually in. She interviewed me for it. But when reading it, I thought this is really interesting, but it's really weird that a book called What About Men is not being written by a man. And so I want to write about something which I think will get me into a lot of trouble, which is I am of the belief that you can talk about heterosexual male desire without that necessarily being about reducing women. This is my central thesis, is that the assumption as I read most feminist texts is that the male gaze, which is what I may call this book, is always objectifying, always dehumanizing, whatever. And I'm not saying it never is. Indeed, I'm not saying it isn't. But what I'm saying is that it's too simplistic to imagine that that's it. That indeed the way that sex works and the sexual gaze of men works is you can do that and it can be dehumanizing, but in the next minute it can be something else. And
Right.
so therefore the sort of sociology of this, for want of a better word, is I do not believe that there is a straightforward link between my desire for women, which even at my age still exists, and imagining that women cannot be presidents and judges and CEOs or whatever, and fully rounded human beings. I think they obviously can be. And if that is the case, then something glitchy is happening, which again I'm interested in the assumption about male desire that I would like to speak about, and men generally are not allowed to do that. But to finish on a joke of some of sorts, is one thing about Jews Don't Count, which is also actually about a group imagined as powerful but and too powerful, and therefore speaking out is sort of problematic. Jews in general, having read that book, and this is slightly self-aggrandizing, but it's true, are grateful for this book. Right? Jews come up to me or write to me all the time, say, "Thank you for writing Jews Don't Count." If I write a book that is very, very deeply honest about male desire, men will not thank me for it. I think men will say you shouldn't have written that, and that hasn't helped at all. But I
Well,
still
we'll have you back when you write that book. Hopefully, you'll make a return on the show.
I look
I want
forward
to
to
be
it.
mindful of your time. Go get Jews Don't Count. Go check him out in his next stand-up comedy tour. Get this, The God Desire. David, what a thrill it is to have met you. Hopefully, we can stay in touch. We didn't get a chance to talk about soccer. Maybe we'll do it next time around. Stay
We'll
on
do
the
that
line
next
so we could
time.
say goodbye. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you.
Cheers.